Damn, you got me thinking of Bishop now. And everything was rainbow, rainbow, rainbow.
Surprised you're thinking of Bishop and not Haas. I don't think Haas will be your guy.
Yeah, I don't. I haven't read any Haas. Although I do have his
Uh,
book, The Little Book of Forms, or The Little Book of Form, or whatever.
yeah, no, for Coming Extinction, I really enjoyed Gray Whale. Now that we are sending you to the end, that great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing.
My
I mean, that's a fucking killer open stanza.
my question about this section, and we can get more into detail, like going over a specific poem with this. Since this is the one, like the Lice in 1967 was the one where he made his kind of big leap from away from punctuation for most of the poems in the collection.
Yeah.
And my just question is, what is that? What does that do? Why would a poet like him go away from those little kind of, useful little marks?
I think for him was just part of him coming into his voice in like, say the early middle part of his career as a writer, like which makes sense, like a little bit older, maybe during this time a little bit more experimental, but also because he's not someone that strikes me as incredibly experimental, someone who is incredibly like someone who feels like just sort of a copy or like they're trying really hard to copy someone else. I feel like it just gave him a flexibility to fall into his voice a little bit more, to take out some of the pauses between sentences that, like, in the same line, I think did his poems a greater justice.
Yeah, and I saw in his stuff like in the 90s, he started to use kind of the spacing on the page as instead of commas. Or, I mean, not he wasn't using commas for years at that point, but he did start to use the kind of white space to imply pauses or hesitations as opposed to the punctuation or standard punctuation that you would see. My theory, why do we go across, like, why? I think he's not the, I mean, was he the first poet to really go away from punctuation? No, right? Like,
Of course not.
E. E. Cummings had already happened at this point, or I guess it was the tail end of E. E. Cummings when he was publishing his first.
I never really read E. Cummings
Yeah,
and know very, very little about. I would say actually I know fucking nothing about E. Cummings,
yeah.
except that he didn't like to use capital letters.
His love poems are his best poems, I'd say, about E. E. Cummings. But yeah, he's another one that just his reputation is such that people they either say they love it or they hate it.
Yeah, I just don't know it.
But like you said, yeah, not using punctuation. Okay, so we get freedom. You're not constrained by the.
It's not even freedom, it's just a different kind of flexibility, right? Like to do something different with like your particular cadence and your, you know, want for urgency in certain places. Just the way it suits his ear, however he hears it.
Uh,
Which I think we also are seeing a lot of right now. That's really hot right now,
yeah,
is to doing the no punctuation bleed over, make this sentence become the next sentence kind of thing, which isn't really, I assume it was more novel at this time, but also like it doesn't, for him it feels like something that works, is very like functional and suits his voice, and not something that just feels overly
well,
stylized
it's interesting.
or experimental for the sake of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up compared to like kind of the contemporary trend or whatever. Not that everybody's doing this, but yeah, it is popular right
I mean,
now.
and we'll like talk about trends as
Yeah.
though like we can see them from some 30,000-foot view, but like we can't actually, we just sort of know what we think we see.
The other side of the coin, no punctuation. Uh, so for me to keep bringing my negativity to this book and Merwin's work is it's easier, right?
No
Yeah.
punctuation? I wouldn't say so. I think it presents its own complications. I think people think that it's easier, and then what? Um, like I think that that's misguided. Like
It's
I think it's
well, you're right.
difficult. I think it's easier if like you are always breaking with syntax. If you are you like maybe it really depends. I think on where you would expect that punctuation to fall.
Well,
If it's naturally going to come at the end of the line and you're always breaking, like, or if it's naturally always going to come, like, if the end of the line and the end of the sentence are always going to coincide, then yeah, not using punctuation is super easy. Or if you're not, if you're always breaking where you would expect there to be a comma, yeah, it's going to be easy. If you're always breaking in exactly the same kind of syntax or the same part of speech every time, that's one thing. You complicate things when there's no capitalization, there's no punctuation, there's no additional space to let you know that a new sentence is starting within the same line.
yeah, there's that. Although he really doesn't use capitalization to indicate sentences.
No, it's not.
Yeah, you're right. Because there, what I mean by that is,
His poems are all initial capped.
yeah, which,
Or not, no, not all of them. The later ones, it looks like aren't actually.
yeah, when word processors and you could change it, then it stopped.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, like so, like when I say easier, it makes it easier if you do nothing else. That's not why I think he's doing it. Because, like you said, you can use other things, and I think he does that. But yeah, if we compare it to the contemporary, I think it's a lot of just kind of imitation, uh, imitating somebody like Merwin or Cummings.
Which is like always going to be a thing, right? Like you're going to see whatever the hot poets are doing or whatever gets you initially interested, and you're going to see how they're experimenting, and you're going to go, "Oh, I want to I want to do the next hot whatever, I'm going to do the next hot collection of persona poems."
And will only
Whatever it is.
and I think it comes from an understanding. So once you understand your own language very thoroughly, and in Merwin's case, you can understand several others. Particularly, he said he mostly did Romance languages, so again, Germanic rooted languages. So it's like those line up a little bit better, but you do learn more about your own language when you're learning like the other languages that branched off from the same thing, type stuff. And I don't know. I think you do start to try and evolve to experiment beyond, yeah, like the kind of structural confines of statements, sentences.
Well, yeah, especially because like he also very much had a voice by now,
Yeah,
right? Or at least like I look at it and I think he does, and maybe to him it felt like somehow different. I don't fucking know. But by the time we get to the lice, it feels like it's super different in voice from his other books before it. It still feels very much like that voice, just slightly like slightly more developed, or like slightly more sort of set into like a style that suits it the best, or like maybe just experimenting to do something slightly different than you had been doing for your last three collections, which is like in some way I think what you hope for, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, you're
oh, well,
always
maybe it's
evolving.
actually not what you hope for, because like at least not as readers of poetry. I feel like when we go to rush out to buy whoever, just put out a hot book, right? If it's like a poet that we know and a poet that we like, and we just read their last book and loved it, we have some expectation that the next book is going to be one that we also like, which is to say that I think sometimes we get angry when style changes and we don't, you know, and maybe it doesn't suit us quite the same, or maybe, it isn't, as it doesn't become as much of like a cult classic. Like, look at Richard Sykin, Crush was like such hot shit. I I don't think anyone really had much to say about War of the Foxes
Yeah,
when it finally came out.
because if you read
And
it,
I don't think it's a, well, yeah, it's not bad though.
it's
Like, it's not, you don't read that and go like, ugh, ugh, like it's not
yeah.
a horrendous book, right? Like it's just not the same. Like it's very different, and it is not the Richard Sykin that we wanted.
Um,
We wanted the Richard Sykin that writes "I touch myself, I dream."
yeah, Sykin's an unusual case though because he just
He puts out a lot
oh,
less.
he's only put out 2 books. I mean, in like 15, 20 years. I mean,
Yeah, some poets will do that. Merwin, I fucking admirable. I
yeah.
mean, he put out a book every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Psychen's a different one, and I'd have to reread both of those back to back here to see what I. But I remember thinking the same thing because it was so different, but it was also like that book felt like, from what I know about Psychen's second book, he was so desperate to not do Crush again because it did get him so much kind of accolades and kind of fame, as much as fame as poets get, which is, not very much at all. It's and I don't know, you can just kind of feel it. There's like so much resistance to, like, you can feel it.
Yeah,
Like there's
and
a
well, and
holding
I think
back,
that like
but
is normal though. Like,
well,
or
I agree that that's
I mean,
normal. It's just you can read the it's like it's a resistance but not in a good way type thing. Is how I would phrase it right now. Not having read either of those books in, like, 5, 6 years.
and sometimes I feel like, you just get fucking sick of yourself.
Yeah. Well, it's a little different too, but
You got to change it.
yeah.
I'm sure that happens too. Or you change it for a minute before returning to the thing that, you were sick of.
Right. Well, we talked about this with Bogan, but I mean, you're looking for something. After a while, it's like, okay, well, now what? All right. Do you want to move on to Carrier of Ladders?